agenda is the road stream crossing assessment manual. And we have Mark Wienerowski from DOT. Hi, Mark.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Wienerowski. I'm an environmental scientist at RIDOT. So we, myself and Nicole Leperacci, who is also Leperacci Lineberry, recently married, wrote a grant. It's a HUD grant that was administered through the Division of Statewide Planning to develop a road stream crossing assessment manual. So our goal, as stated in our grant application, was to provide a comprehensive look at all of our culverts in the state, a methodology to do that, and then complete a pilot study so that we could demonstrate that our methods work and give reasonable results. Our consultant that we selected to complete this project was Fussin O'Neill, due in large part to their experiences doing this sort of work in Aquatuck and elsewhere. So I'm going to pass the presentation on to them.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Eric Moss. I'm with Fussin O'Neill, and I'm the lead for our team on the project. Rachel Whiter is the lead on the project. She'll tag team with me in the next 10 minutes or so. We're going to give you a high-level overview of the project, and hopefully have some time for questions and discussion after we present some of our slides. So why are we looking at road stream crossings? Well, there are approximately 4,000 crossings statewide in Rhode Island. These are culverts, bridges, and other types of crossings. And obviously with this amount of infrastructure, and transportation system infrastructure, all of these are getting older. Many of them are outdated, are aging. Many of them are undersized and in poor structural condition. And so they're vulnerable to storms, to extreme storms, to flooding. We all have seen some of the effects of that flooding statewide. So in 2010, we saw many structures in the state fail or have major issues in terms of being undersized and cause flooding. We also know that with increased precipitation, extreme precipitation, and with increased intensity and frequency, and also sea level rise and storm surge, many of these vulnerable structures are going to see more extreme potential flooding and damage during some of these larger events. So the goal of the project here really was to find a way to develop a method so that we could assess statewide structures in a consistent, kind of a thoughtful manner, taking into account a number of different factors to look at replacing some of this aging infrastructure with larger crossing structures. One, to address the flood resiliency issue, and also to increase the ecosystem resiliency, so to increase the connectivity of our streams, many of which are experiencing sort of that loss of habitat connection. Many of these structures act as barriers to fish and other aquatic organisms. So the goal really was dual, to address flood resiliency and also ecological resilience. So as I mentioned, the manual itself, really the major goal is to develop this standardized methodology statewide that can be used by not only DOT, but also municipalities, nonprofit groups, watershed associations, organizations, and other folks who are interested in identifying which crossings should be highest priority for replacement in terms of upsizing some of these structures. Again, it's Rhode Island DOT's manual, but they're interested in really providing a tool that can be used more broadly beyond just the state. So the manual itself uses a definition of road stream crossing that includes really any bridge, culvert, or other kind of crossing. So fords, some of these other less common crossings. We looked at crossings in the state that essentially crossings of blue line streams. So these are mapped stream crossings. Again, whether it's a road, rail, other type of transportation infrastructure. There are about 4,000 statewide. An important distinction is that these are not drainage culverts. This project does not address drainage crossings. It's really focused on crossings of flowing streams, since flowing streams really have a greater potential for more significant damage during floods. So we also considered two major climate change elements in the manual. And we integrated both increases in precipitation and peak flows, so flooding in inland areas. We also looked at sea level rise and storm surge. And the idea here was to incorporate some of the current projections for climate change into these kinds of elements of the manual using existing tools and existing projections. We wanted to take advantage of all the good work that's been done statewide through the statewide planning and others in the state and also in the Northeast, come up with kind of accepted methods for our projections. In terms of precipitation and peak flows, the manual incorporates a 20% increase in both extreme precipitation and also in extreme peak flows. So this is generally consistent with guidance in Rhode Island, but also some of the neighboring states use similar guidance. Massachusetts and New Hampshire have similar, anywhere between 10 and 25% increases. So the manual doesn't incorporate this 20% increase across the board over all of the design storms that we considered from the 10-year to the 100-year events.
I'm sorry, could you just for clarity go back?
Sure.
The difference between extreme precipitation, very heavy precipitation, and that 71, is that 21 or 71?
71.
Yeah, 71.
71% number that's
Right.
observed.
That graphic basically is the percent increase in extremely heavy precipitation events. You can see that the Northeast obviously has seen the greatest increase. The time period for this is, I believe, approximately 1960 or so to present.
And is that defined as what, like more than an inch of rain in a day, or what is it?
More than an inch of rain in 24 hours.
24-hour period, right.
So we're experiencing 71%, but we're planning for 20%?
That 71% increase, it does not, it doesn't equate to the same 20% factor that we're using. The 20% is really a multiplication factor. We're taking the existing peak flows from the 10-year storm up to the 100-year storm and multiplying that value by 20% to get a projected future peak flow.
Out to the end of the century.
Exactly.
Thank you.
In terms of sea level rise, what we did is we're looking at the storm tools data sets, and these are the inundation tools that were developed back in 2015 and 2016 from the statewide transportation planning group did a transportation study looking at all the statewide crossings. The storm tools layers are developed for 0 to 7 feet of sea level rise. So what we're doing with this manual is incorporating those inundation data layers and using that to kind of quantify the potential vulnerability of the crossing that lies within one of those inundation boundaries, essentially. And this is for the 100-year storm surge data set. So really we're kind of piggybacking on top of projections that are already out there for the transportation infrastructure along the coast of the state.
So I'm going to take a step back and walk you through the broader project framework and some of the different pieces, the different tools that we're including in the manual. So the most obvious piece of this framework is the manual itself. And as Eric said, it's intended to be a statewide methodology. So we've developed methods that can be applied universally across the strait, whether you're inland or near the coast, urban or rural. And it's built on existing methods, particularly the methods developed by the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Collaborative at UMass Amherst, which has really pioneered some of the first major coastal crossing assessments in the Northeast. But it builds on these methods while staying consistent with them and is actually more comprehensive. Been looking at this stuff for several years, and as far as we can tell, this is probably the most comprehensive methodology for this type of work in the country, possibly the world. So the one large piece that Mark mentioned is the pilot study, and as he said, this is to test and demonstrate our methods. I'll talk to that a little bit later. And then the final piece is outreach, and so we've performed some outreach already through the project. including meetings with the stakeholder group and with yourselves. And for this project, that's the limit of the outreach at this stage, but there will be additional opportunities for outreach in the future.
Did I miss this at the beginning? Is DOT now implementing this in all budget going forward?
Not yet, and I can't speak to that specifically. Maybe Mark can talk a little bit more about the implementation at the end.
Okay, great.
So the basis of our technological framework is the mathematical definition of risk, which is the probability that a structure will fail multiplied by the magnitude of the impact of that failure. And we took a number of factors that are shown in these two diagrams that typically affect the risk at a crossing or the benefit of its removal. Eric already spoke somewhat to the hydraulic risk or the capacity of the culvert and the capacity of that culvert under future climate change conditions. We also took a look at structural condition. So, is the culvert structurally sound or is it ready to fall down? We took a look at geomorphic conditions in the culvert, and these refer to the shape of the river, of the channel that the culvert is set in, and how that's likely to change over time and that function. We took a look at aquatic organism passage, which is how passable the crossing is to a given species, and we didn't look at a species-specific measure of aquatic passage, but one that is more broad, so everything from a crayfish to a fish. And we also took a look at the ecological benefit of removing these crossings, because it doesn't provide a lot of benefit to an organism to be able to get past a barrier if the water quality or the other habitat conditions past that barrier are not good enough to allow it to survive. And as a last piece, looking at the second term of this equation, we took a look at flood impacts. So these impacts included backwater flooding impacts upstream of the culvert if it gets clogged and acts like a dam. It includes downstream impacts if the culvert was to fail and send a wave of sediment and concrete and water downstream all at once. And we looked at the direct impact of transportation if a crossing were to be flooded out or washed out. So that concerns how much traffic travels on any given road during a day. Is the road a hurricane evacuation route? And is that road on a primary E911 route? I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what kind of sections we have in the manual to give you an idea of how folks can step through it. So the first is an introduction, letting people know what the purpose of the manual is, letting them know that if they're looking to assess drainage culverts, they've come to the wrong place, and things of that nature. Sections 2 through 4 deal with the field assessment, and this is by far the bulk of the manual because a lot of this methodology depends on getting good field data. And it also, these data assessment methods also include QA/QC to make sure that the data is complete and of good quality. Sections 5 through 12 then go into a desktop data analysis that looks at all of these factors and turns them into a score, which is then used later in the prioritization to develop an overall relative crossing priority score. And then section 13 deals with the actual crossing prioritization itself. And it's important to emphasize that when we're talking about prioritization, we're not giving an absolute number as to how important a crossing is to remove or not. We're giving a relative ranking instead. So if you get a number of crossings that get above a certain score per this scoring methodology and are therefore considered high priority, these are the culverts or the bridges that you might want to look at first and look into removing them, as opposed to some that are likely at a lower overall risk and might fall into lower priorities. Section 14 talks about next steps in implementation in a very limited way. So another thing that this manual is not is a design manual. It doesn't really go into the individual design steps, but it does give the reader an idea of what the next steps might be to get from this assessment, from this prioritized list of crossings, to the design phase. So it talks about project partnerships, it talks about possible funding sources, and it talks about And then we have a number of appendices and tools that we've developed that will be included with the manual. So we've developed forms that I'll talk about next. We've developed some digital tools that can be used to help facilitate this assessment. We provided some references and the aforementioned pilot study.
So we're running a bit short on time, so should we make sure just to buy?
Yeah. So one of the high points is that most of the methodologies in the past have used paper forms, and perhaps the nicest term for this type of methodology is clunky. So we've developed a digital data form that can be used on tablets that eliminates a lot of that scanning and getting your papers wet and maybe losing some of them, and can upload that data directly to a database so that it's ready for that digital assessment. So these are just some images of that. And then the pilot study was where we really put these methods to the test. We assessed them in the Winnebago Bucket River watershed, approximately 990 crossings. And in addition to testing and refining the methods, we've developed the pilot study in a way that it matches up with the manual so that the user can use it as a real-world reference that augments the manual and helps demonstrate the methods described. And so this is provided as an appendix. And some of the benefits of doing this is that we were able to clarify things that might be confusing for a layperson looking to implement this methodology. We revised the paper and digital field forms to make them even more efficient. And we were able to determine the approximate amount of time needed per crossing for planning purposes. So with that, we'll take some questions.
I have a couple, but we know we are running short time. One, I was just wondering about transit. Is that, it seems like this issue would apply similarly to train tracks, and this is purely looking at roads?
No, it could look at, we've looked at footpaths, railroad tracks, bike paths, really anything that crosses a stream can be assessed using this
I
methodology.
did not look at the pilot study just for safety reasons.
Yeah.
Access to
And then the question, my earlier question, Mark, I mean, in terms of outreach, you don't need to do outreach yourself.
We are going to do at least one more outreach of that. We're currently trying to figure out how to do it. We're trying to make a more positive presentation in the near future.
I mean, but what I was going with that though, is this, in terms of resiliency and our federally funded road projects, is this something that moving forward to be incorporated?
There is no current plan for this to be implemented at time.
So is the audience municipalities?
That was the, so that's what it's turned into. So at the time that this was written, Meredith was that was our implementation plan, which is the last.
So your comment on
You're under the bus.
No, I think, yeah,
internal buy-in is, so internal outreach is needed.
Okay.
Yes. This is not being implemented
Yeah.
directly.
And sorry, just related to that, in your assessment of the majority of the locations on municipal-owned roads or state-owned?
Typically, yeah, it was municipally owned roads. We didn't perform assessments on state-owned roads because we didn't have the safe access as non-state employees. Municipally owned roads are the vast majority. We very rarely have assessed privately owned roads, but you can do so if you arrange prior access. So if, say, you had a railroad line running through your study area, probably the best move would be to contact that railroad company at the line or track road.
We did assess state-owned road traffic. We stayed away from the federal lines. Just and I don't want to get into the ownership structure, but a lot of times the bridges are owned by DOT. So the assumption was that if it's a road stream crossing, the chances are DOT is going to be responsible for replacement. That was our mindset.
So this doesn't have any regulatory implications for permitting for private projects or public projects?
No, not yet.
Not yet, worries me. What do you mean not yet? is it planned to? One of the things that we hear often is we want predictability. What do I have to do to get an answer? What do I need to get a permit? And what it implies is that there's a scheme that's in place that's unofficial regulation with the potential for it. And to me, it could be above and beyond the stormwater manual, which is what the design world is using to get permits to do projects. And it could very well be they've got someone has a stream crossing that's existing or could be on a piece of private property, and what's a local community going to require? I'm just nervous about predictability and permitting, and you've got a multi-step mechanism of do this, do that, collect a lot of data. That sounds expensive.
And it can
Unless
be.
you own it, or
So-
unless you own the software.
A method like this doesn't really have any permitting regulations because all it is assessing. And usually it has more impact on funding. It can help municipalities or other groups justify funding for, especially getting federal funding because some of those agencies want to see, some demonstration that this culvert really is a priority. Typically, where I've seen permitting regulations come into play in other states is with the design guidelines. And again, these aren't design guidelines. It's when you're saying, well, now your road street crossing, has to be 1.2 times bankful width, such as in Massachusetts. And that has become a permitting requirement in that state because the Army Corps and the Massachusetts wetland regulations now hold that as their minimum. So that's where permitting would come in. This manual doesn't affect that.
I'll leave my caution on.
Yeah, well, I think maybe one nice follow-up step, Mark, would be to have a meeting with you. Terry Gray, the head of our regulatory and environmental protection programs, is right there. You probably know Terry. But maybe have a meeting where you demonstrate this and talk about what the implications are or should be. And I had a question, you said it's only about streams. Could it be used for drainage as well, or is that?
It wouldn't, some parts of it could be, but certainly the aquatic organism passage piece doesn't make sense. And some, and the geomorphic piece doesn't make sense because drainage culverts don't act like streams. They don't evolve in form like streams. So the applicability to drainage culverts will be limited.
And then one other question, does the model look like, so I do some breakwood replacement upstream, that just compounds your problem downstream in town?
Right, we did mention that in the implementation, in some of that guidance that you want to think about that when you're making the final choice on which culverts to replace. This isn't, and there's a lot of cautions written in that this is not a final answer to which culverts you should replace in which order. So you want to take a look at, how they're going to be impacted. If you're increasing the size of culvert upstream, you're very likely going to be increasing the flow rate downstream. And one of the other benefits, you said that this could cost a lot of money, and it can. The goal is to do this when you have a sense that it would save you money in the long run by helping you figure out which crossings to replace before a disaster, so that you don't have to do it after. Because what we've seen after Hurricane Sandy and Irene is that if those crossings had been replaced before, despite the larger capital cost, it would have been a lot less expensive in the long run because there wouldn't have been the damage that resulted from the failure of the crossing in addition to the cost of replacing the crossing. Or in some cases, having to replace it twice because they just slapped an in-kind replacement in beforehand, not knowing whether it was undersized or not.
So it's another place that could help in the event that you do lose a crossing, you have a way.
Yeah, if you, maybe if this predicted it and you saw that one was undersized, it can help you understand what happened.
It's really to help apply limited funds to address some of these problems crossings in the state.
Do you have any?
Yeah, short question, and then
Do you have any numbers around that last statistic of the Sandy related?
We don't in particular, but I think it's possible the folks at Rhode can help you out with that.
And thank you very much. Somehow we've run short of time. I didn't. That excellent presentation. Thank you, Mark and Rachel. And then maybe if people have questions after, they can find you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.